Welcome to Genuine Chit-Chat, where we have honest conversations with interesting people. And I'm your host, Myq Burton. I am joined today by Myq Kaplan. He is a stand-up comedian, and hello there, Myq.
Hello, thanks for having me.
No worries at all. Thank you for reaching out. And we'll say it at the start and we'll say it at the end as well, but one of the reasons that we end up essentially talking was because you're coming to the UK and you're doing a couple of shows. So why don't you throw them out there at the start and then we'll get on with it.
Absolutely. Now, with everyone having absolutely no understanding of who I am or why, it's sort of like clapping at the beginning of a comedy show, like a round of applause for what you're about to see. You know, optimistically, should everything go according to plan as desired for the people who want. I will be at the Soho Theater on February 26th, Tuesday through March 2nd. Saturday, that's 2019. So thanks for listening and coming out to those shows if you do.
No worries. I'll put all the dates and whatnot in the description and things. And if there's any links or anything like that, you can fire them my way over email and that sort of jazz. But you know, you are a stand-up comedian, which is incredibly interesting in amongst itself. But you also are a podcaster, and you also, from listening to some of your podcasts, would you class yourself as a musician?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I've played music my almost entire conscious life. My parents were music teachers, and so I started taking violin lessons when I was 4, and I did that through all of my childhood. I played in orchestras and different groups, mainly the violin, and then in high school, taught myself guitar. And then that's actually what led me to comedy as well. I just had some funny songs and started playing them. So professionally, I don't make my living via music. So if somebody said, fill out on a form where I had to put my occupation, I wouldn't put musician. But if you said informally, if nobody's gonna be auditing me, then then I would say yes. I'm definitely a musician, much more than people who aren't musicians, and maybe a little less than people who are musicians.
Very concise. That's great. And with your podcast as well, the intro music and outro music, is that, I assume, made by yourself?
Yes, I did all of that. I've a friend of mine and I, actually a few different friends, and I have made we both like making music and have friends who have podcasts. So sometimes when I've co-written maybe almost probably a dozen different podcast themes, including a few for myself and for a lot of friends.
Oh, nice. And also a lot of people are going to basically see, obviously, who you are as in MYQ. Is that like your actual birth name, or is that sort of a thing to make you stand out a little bit more out of interest?
Great question. It's a question that what if I told you no one's ever asked me anything about it before?
I would think you're lying.
Yeah, that would be an absolute. We're on the same page. But it is actually interesting the way that you asked. I like, because it's neither my birth name nor something that I chose specifically for search engine optimization. I guess it's closer to the second, because when I was a teenager, I was at a summer camp. I don't know. I know there's a lot of British counselors would come, like a sort of a 21-year-olds would come over from England, and I guess they would get kind of a deal to see some of America. And
one of my mates did that. One of my friends who's been on this podcast has actually done that. Yeah, he went over there, met his now ex, but he met a guy over there who he was with for a while, and he said it was fantastic over there.
Yeah, so I don't know how, if there are also, if summer camp is a thing or is not as much a thing in the UK itself, or if everyone's just shipping over here.
We don't get much for summer, to be honest with you. We get a lot of, it's slightly brighter, but it's very, very unpredictable. So it's not quite as concise sometimes. It's it's summer, vaguely. Let's book a barbecue for 2 weeks' time. Is it, that might be, is it going to be drizzle on that day? It's it's the middle of July. It's yes, exactly. That's the problem.
So might as well just come to Connecticut in July in America. But yeah, so I was there. It was a performing and creative arts summer camp, and I was sort of blossoming as an adolescent, like learning how to be a human being, how to have friends, how to, create the art that I cared about, which, I was sort of made to play the violin, and that wasn't my favorite thing, but I started first painting and then writing and then, playing the guitar and making music that I did care about. And at the same time, so I feel like there was all these creative juices flowing. And then Prince changed his name to a symbol around that time when I was probably like 14-ish. And I thought that was like, that guy's weird and cool. He's doing a strange thing. Like, I'm strange. I'll do a strange thing. And so it was like initially sort of inspired by just the idea of like, becoming a new person, like having like a new identity, like, choosing a name, choosing a persona or something at the time that I was just like, this is weird and fun. I since would go on to study linguistics. I would get a graduate degree in linguistics. So like words and letters and, like sort of the math of language were always things that interested me. And so at that time I was just like, oh yeah, why not? Why not spell a thing a different way? Why not say a thing a different way? Why not, try to, perhaps as a comedian as well, seeing the world, in different perspectives, seeing the same thing, from different angles. So that was a thing that, yes, I did it.
Nice. Okay. Well, it's one of the things with your stand-up comedy. One of the things I implore people to go out and check. It's on Amazon, so you can check it. It's called Small, Dork and Handsome, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, and that you are very clever with your. I think a lot of British listeners, especially, will really like your comedy because it's very much. It sounds really silly to say out loud, but like word orientated, like the way you say things and like alternative wording. And I'm not saying I'm a stand-up comedian or even funny in any way, but like what I like to do with certain words and things is just replace words with other things. Like one thing I do, which people it's a nice conversation starter. If I'm ever out drinking or whatever and I need the loo, I'll say I'm going to the lavatory or I'm going to the water closet or something like, or sometimes the urination station. And those, if I say any of those things, people get like, a lot of people think it's mildly amusing and things, which is mainly the point of it. But a lot of people get like really weirded out and they go, what, the lavatory? So well, technically that is what it's called. Like it is odd for me, like a 25-year-old person in 2019 to say lavatory, but I do quite like swapping out words and many other things that me and my friends do. Do you do that sort of thing a lot as well, or is it like your interest in words? Obviously, you did a linguistics, some sort of qualification in that. So, 2 half questions, sending away.
Oh yeah, no, I do some similar things. Like here, I think I have a lot to say about this.
Good.
So the first, a thing that I do that's in one way exactly like what you do, and in another way, the opposite, because it's about taking in food and drink as opposed to the elimination thereof. But similarly, like when I sometimes go to a restaurant, and it's interesting. Also, I'll disclaim. Disclaimers within disclaimers here. I'll aim to complete all the parentheticals, but. For me, like listening to you are a British person, I am an American person, and so there are already some things that you might say that would strike me as not the standard thing to say but that would be standard for you. So like if we were out at a pub and you're like, I'm going to hit the lavatory, I wouldn't be like, what? Because I'm like, oh, I guess British people say lavatory sometimes. And then if I never met another British person that ever did it, then I might be like, oh, that's one weird British person. But But right now, I could be just thinking like, oh, all British people are weird. Or maybe all British people are normal and all Americans are weird. Or certainly I'm weird. But obviously there can be, on a graph, you could have many quadrants of weird to not weird. And in some ways, I think everyone does have some weird things. Some people don't know what their weird things are. Like, and I think maybe one of the jobs or like delights of being a comedian is to realize like how rich one's own life might be when you're like, oh, that thing, like the way that I was raised, either in my family, in my community, in my country, in my culture, like things that I thought were like, oh, everyone does those things. And then you find out, oh, everyone doesn't do those things. Sometimes And then you're like, oh, well, I guess then that's funny. Like, oh, my, whether it's sometimes they're painful things, sometimes they're things that you get over, challenges. But to answer your question, so to continue to never answer your question, sometimes when I go into a restaurant, instead of saying, like, if I'm there, let's say with a friend and we're going to eat dinner, I will, instead of saying like, a table for two, please, I'd say that's like the standard thing to say in that situation. I might say 2 for eating, please. And that's a thing that is not I don't think most people say that. And I do it because it is fun and because I never want to add like more trouble for people, especially, people working in the service industry, like people working at restaurants. They have a lot to deal with. I worked as a barista selling coffee for years, and it was always fun when people would be playful and also, get to the point, like so that if you knew what you wanted to communicate and the communication could happen as desired, but also there could be a bonus fun thing. Like here's an analogy. Like when I was a kid, I had a lot of t-shirts that had like either, fun writing on them or fun pictures on them. And then like, I feel like that continued through college. Like sometimes you get a free t-shirt for signing up for a credit card or something. You're like, oh, cool t-shirt. At a certain point, I don't care. I don't know that much about fashion. And so I would have like girlfriends who would once in a while be like, we should get you some like nice clothing. And so a lot of the nice clothing that I've had over the years was like through the help of people who knew better than me at the time about like what would look good. Be like, don't wear that t-shirt. And so I'm only now, like I'm 40 years old now, and in the past years, I'm like, oh, there's like, so I can wear like fun t-shirts again if I want to in certain circumstances. Like there's this t-shirt company called like Sure Design t-shirts, and they have like some shirts that have trees on them or owls or different animals, and they're kind of like psychedelic like in a little bit, and they're like beautiful, and they're sort of like there's like art on the shirt. And so I feel like, do you know there's this this Zen koan or this Zen idea called chop wood, carry water, which is before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. And that's sort of a metaphor for, a lot of different things. Like, for example, like, how do you do comedy? Like, well, if you're starting out doing comedy, you just write and you perform as much as possible, even though you don't know what you're doing. And then through the course of doing it, you learn by doing, and then you attain some measure of at least more enlightenment than you had before you'd ever done anything. And you're like, oh, now I get it a little bit. Now I get what I'm doing. And now the secret is keep doing what I was doing. Put in the work, just keep doing the time and, putting in that energy and those resources. And like, because there is no grander, greater secret. There is no like ultimate final dimension that you enter. It's always just putting in the work and time and doing the effort. And so similarly, I feel like being a child, you're maybe being a child is like, you don't know what you're doing. And then you go through adolescence, you become a young adult. And like, there's never any point where you're like, aha, finally, I've learned everything. But sometimes the point of being an adult, or one of the points, or one of the joys of being an adult, is discovering, like, if as an artist, as a comedian, as a musician, like tapping back into like the childlike wonder that one had, when you were doing it, like not self-consciously, when you didn't know that you might be judged for the art that you were making or the work that you were creating. And then to hopefully just have that as an adult, knowing that there will be people who do that, but not caring as much. So you sort of have the same pattern of starting by just doing it, then becoming aware and like knowing something, be like, oh no, maybe I should stop. But then after that, being like, no, don't stop. Keep going. Keep doing what you were doing as a younger person. So similarly with t-shirts, I was like, as a kid, just wear whatever my parents bought me, whatever looked good in my drawer. And then eventually when other people were like, you could look in a, you're a grown up now, be a grown up. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll dress like a grown up now. And now I'm on the other side of that. And I'm like, oh, I don't don't care about being a quote unquote grown up. I care about being, a kind human being and a productive member of society. And, I care about treating people and myself and the world as best I can. And also, I could wear a blank shirt or I could wear a shirt with a fun thing on it. I could go into a restaurant and say things normally and let people have their ordinary experience, which is just fine, or could have like a bonus experience of getting the same information communicated with also then being like, why not? Here's also, if you want to have fun, you can. And if not, you can just show me to my table, and I appreciate that.
Exactly. And I mean, with that, me and my friend Reese especially, we do that sort of thing all the time. Like we do a thing which is it's really simple, and 9 times out of 10 people understand what we're saying. But it's things like if we were going to Scotland or something, we wouldn't just say we're going to Scotland, just saying going to the land of Scots, which obviously that makes sense. But then you do other things like I'm going back to the land of Eng, and they're like, what? I was England. So that sort of ridiculousness of just depending on who I'm with will depend on what I say that to, because some people you say it to and they just have no idea what the hell you're saying. But most of my friends just either appreciate it with a sigh or just don't even make any kind of vocal acknowledgement at all. Just kind of, let's pretend I didn't say something stupid like that. But it is interesting you said about the sort of growing up in the adolescence and that sort of thing, because it made me think of an analogy that I've got. Maybe it's an analogy I've heard somewhere else and completely stealing it, but I think it's original. But let's find out if you've heard it or not. It works in many facets. Like I imagine it would work when it comes to comedy, but it works in like a lot of things. But the main way it works is being a child, being a teenager, being an adult. Now, obviously, teenagers a lot of the time, and especially sort of preteens, think they know everything in a way. I myself am definitely guilty of this. And as you become an adult, you realise you know nothing, essentially. And the more you actually find out, the more you realise you actually don't know. The analogy I give for that is almost like your entire life you've got this like sort of almost this door of adulthood in your way sort of thing, and there's a little keyhole, and when you're a kid you can just kind of peek through the keyhole, you can kind of jump and look through it and you can barely see it. And then when you get to like a preteen or a teenager, you can actually stand up and you can just, without really having to try, you can just look through that keyhole for ages. And at that point, that's normally when teenagers are like, oh, I know all this, I know everything, that sort of mentality. And then what happens is when you're actually like an air quotes an adult, whenever that is, someone then opens the door, and then you step into the door and you realize it wasn't just a room that you were looking into, that you thought, you look through the keyhole, you think you know every detail about that room because you look through the keyhole, and then the door opens and it's a room that's bigger than comprehension, like bigger than 1,000 castles, and it's just completely full of an incredible amount of things. And that's when you kind of realize, oh shit, I really thought I knew a lot, and then I just know nothing at all. Is that kind of what it's like with comedy out of interest, or sort of music and things like that? Other sort of passions that you've pursued?
I'll say short answer, yes. Long answer, yes. I don't know who's... That's somebody's joke, and I love it. That one for sure. It's funny to think of like things that are original versus quote unquote not original, because also like neither of us like invent language. We didn't create these words. Like, of course that doesn't mean that you can't, copyright something or construct a sentence that had never been constructed before. But also in some ways, all ideas, like nothing is original, and everything is just sort of flowing through, this incarnation, this body, this mind, this consciousness, and it's made of things that, you were a baby and you had never heard anything, and then people talked around you, and then you heard words and ideas, and then started potentially constructing and formulating your own new ones. Here's a brief tangent. I read about some, I think rats that were in given mazes, and they were doing experiments on the rats and looking at their brains while they were running the maze and then while they dreamed. And if a rat did one maze, then it would dream of that maze at night sometimes. And they could tell, it looked like it was running through the maze in its mind. And then sometimes they would have a rat go through 2 different mazes. And then sometimes it would dream of one maze, sometimes it would dream of the other, and sometimes it would dream of something completely distinct from either of those mazes, meaning that they had been sort of constructing and combining and creating brand new pathways that had never existed because now they've gone through 2 different things. And that's, I think, what it's also like to be a human being. Like if somebody tells you the one idea, if you look into one room, if you have, one language at your disposal, one art form, one tool, one set of tools, then you have like one modality of thinking. And if you add another to it, it's not now that it doubles, but it sort of multiplies and maybe increases, mathematically or geometrically, or geometrically seems like a subset of mathematically as well. And so I'm good with words, and I got a math minor, so my limitations exist. I was like, ooh, I started that sentence, and I was like, I've reached the end of it. But yeah, I think another point or question for your analogy, which I hadn't heard before, but does make complete sense for like, I feel like life in general and so many subsets of it. But like, I'm imagining like the kid, like when you're a kid looking through it, or when you're a teenager, and then the door opens, and it might not even be, it might be just outside. It might be like the rest of the world. Like literally, in some ways, you were probably in a room, in a house. You were confined. You were like, oh, this is everything in your in your home, in your town, in your community. Like think about, we're so in some ways fortunate, at least in this way, that we have access to, like if we were born, 1,000 years ago, you and I would probably never have met, never have talked, never been able to. Most people, I think in America, I went to, where was it? It was Thomas Jefferson's, I think, childhood home or adulthood home, maybe his whole life home, Monticello. And I think that I was told it was like maybe a 2-story house or maybe a 3-story house. And I was told that the people who grew up around there, that would have been the tallest building they ever saw, because most people at that time never left, I'd think, either a 20 or 40 mile radius of where they were born. Just in their entire lives, very few people would go farther than 20 to 40 miles. I forget which one it was, but either way, let's say 40. They wouldn't, it would be a very rare person to go out into the world at all. So, and the fact is that we don't know what our limitations are. We don't know what our blind spots are until, like, if you have your family, you might think like, oh, every dad is like my dad, every mom is like my mom. Then you meet somebody and they're like, I have 2 moms, I have 2 dads, I have a non-binary parent, I have 3 parents, I have no parents, I have, and you're like, oh, I didn't realize. And as a person in my society, I'm a white person, a man, a heterosexual person. I have all of these, privileges that I didn't know. I'm like swimming with all of the currents. I'm told by my family, by society, like, oh, you can do anything, you can be anything. And it seems like, I'm like, oh, wow, we can do anything. Like, it seems like we're telling everyone that. It seems like every child grows up like that. It seems like that because I grew up like that. But then I'm learning from other people, from my girlfriend who talks to me about her experience as a woman, which isn't always the same. Listening to people of color talk about their experiences, which certainly in many relevant ways to being alive aren't the same. That, of course, I mean, it's interesting that I know that even, I'm the limitations that we all face limitations, but we all face different limitations and on different scopes and scales. And so, yes, to answer your question, it certainly seems like similarly, I'll say, to start with comedy. And when you start with comedy, you're like a child in a room. You don't know what you're doing. You're kind of feeling around. You're just like, I don't know, this maybe. And maybe you find one thing that works. And then you start doing that thing. And then maybe, I mean, even for, I guess I can only talk about it. I can speak for myself. When I started doing comedy, it was all just like one-line jokes, just one idea at a time, and I would say it, and it would either work or it wouldn't. And maybe I would try to reorder the words if I thought it was a funny idea, but I was just like, I would say it exactly as I planned it, and it was just, kind of like, I loved Mitch Hedberg, I loved Stephen Wright and Emo Phillips and Dimitri Martin, and I was like, these guys, it's just like each joke was like a little math equation. And then maybe 4 years into comedy, I was getting better. And it seemed like a numbers game. It seemed like science. Like if I write 1,000 things and I try them as many out as I can, I find out which ones have maybe the most potential initially, and I try those more and I fix those up. And then if I keep writing 1,000 jokes every month or year or whatever, however long it takes to make them, eventually I'll just by sheer force of numbers have enough. I'll build an act. And I would do that like one line at a time, one joke at a time, one chunk at a time. And then 4 years in, I saw, the comedian Rory Scovel?
I'm afraid I don't know.
Don't be afraid. He is, no need to fear. He's not a scary man. But
I've got my safety blanket.
Oh, yes. Rory is wonderful. He has, I don't know if we have the exact same, things available on Netflix, but in America, he has a special on Netflix that I think is actually called Rory Scovel Does Comedy for the First Time, or does stand up for the first time, which is not the truth. He many years before he recorded that special, which I think is a funny name for a special, we performed at this Seattle comedy competition together in about 2006, and the competition was maybe 15 of us in each of 2 weeks, and so I was every night for like maybe 6 nights in 1 week. We 15 people would perform in different orders in different venues around the Seattle, Washington area. And most people would do the same 5-minute set every night, and you would perform for different judges, different audiences, in a biker bar one night, at a college the next night, in front of, at a country club or at a just different weird venues, to try and test people in front of different circumstances. I thought it was a cool idea. And so most people were just like, I'll be the control. I'll have my comedy be the control in all of these variable situations, because that's kind of, in some ways, like, we aren't one thing. We're always growing and changing and shifting. But at the time, that's a thing that I think a child thinks, and then also some adults. And it's useful. It's a useful, like, sort of constructed fiction to be like, here is who I am. And not to say that people's identities are fictions even, but they're certainly in some ways constructs, and sometimes they're useful and practical, and sometimes they're not, because also, if your identity at one point was child, at some point you're like, well, I'm an adult, but I still identify as child. In some ways, maybe that's useful and valuable too, or at least to have the conversation. But what Rory did that was different than most other people was he would do a different set every night. Sometimes the same jokes in a different order. Sometimes at the end of a joke, he would like live in the world of that joke like longer, and like sort of play in sort of the sandbox of the joke and find new things and create new things, build new castles and like go into them and live there. And he would move around each space and find things in the places, and he would just be in the moment, and he would riff and create in a way that he does it in a way that's unique to him, but riffing isn't unique to him. And so, but it was to me a foreign idea at the time, because I was basically sort of trained to, or I had trained myself to, like, write comedy as symphonies, to be like, but he was, a jazz improviser. And those are, while jazz and classical are both genres of music, they're both valid. You don't hear as much about like genres of comedy, other than maybe you think about like political comedy, observational comedy, but ultimately every comedian is hopefully their own genre, and you might have some tools that other people use or other skills, but Rory is Rory, and I am me, and I am a growing, changing self. And so one of the big paradigm shifts, one like door that I had been that I didn't even realize I could go through and be outside or in this place, was to be like, oh, I can also, in addition to writing and preparing all the jokes that I want to, like, let's say if an idea didn't go the way that I wanted it to, I could keep living in the world of that joke. I could keep talking about it. I could keep, finding more, pretty much, writing on stage was a thing that I had never done, that I started doing, which is a much shorter way to tell that story. But it definitely did seem like a whole world opened, which also then sort of touches on other like related things that would come up only like years and years later in my life. Like a few years ago, I started meditating. Like I'd heard about meditation, lots of my life. Like it's a word that I think most people are familiar with after a certain point, but I had an idea of it, like sort of a a premeditated idea
I see what you did there.
of what it would, and that's something that I sincerely never thought about that like that. I never came at this topic from this direction, but the idea that I had was, I guess, just somebody sitting and being like and like relaxing, or whatever your stereotype of a meditating person might be. But I thought, like, oh well, I've got too many things to do. There's too much stuff. There's too many like TV shows to watch and too many experiences to have. I can't have like nothing be the experience. But the experience of meditating is not nothing, even if it is sometimes like letting go of anxieties, letting go of thoughts that could control you, or could grab you for longer than they need to. Just sort of like noting thoughts and being present, being like, oh yes, there's that, and now there's this, and that's okay. And everybody has different like needs and desires. Like some people might want to relax more, some people might want to buckle down more, or regardless of what they want, they might need to. And so I think that discovering that like new tool in comedy was also a matter of becoming more present, learning that I could be more present. And that is something that I think is unique in that it's the only thing that there is. There's only like one thing, which is, the here and now and being present. But also it is then not unique, as it's, can arise in any walk of life, whether you're an artist, a musician, a comedian, a writer, or just in a conversation with a person. If you're just in a moment talking to a friend about being returning to the land of Aang, which also it's funny because that's sort of a back formation that if you go far enough back, like England is named after the land of Angles or Anglos, I believe.
Yeah, like Anglo-Saxons or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not as far. It's like sometimes there are jokes that it seems like there's a double meaning, but it's really just the same meaning from like two having like far like divergent points in like in the word's histories. Like there's, do you know this knock knock? There's a knock knock joke. It's like knock knock, who's there? Egypt who? And it's Egypt me out of my money or something. And do you know the verb to gyp, like GYP?
No, I don't.
So this joke won't even make sense to you as a joke, because it's sort of it's a kind of a slur that comes from the root of like gypsy, like the idea
yes.
that gypsies,
we call it Jippo over here. So that's probably why it was slight unknowing what it was. There you go.
Oh yeah. And so Egypt, the place, was also named from that same root, from which gypsy or Jippo comes. So in fact, like the double meaning like isn't present at all, and also the word like that verb is sort of like a slur upon the people, the Roma people, who aren't all going around robbing, putting spells, stealing babies. But so similarly, whatever, and that's a great analogy to whatever I was just talking about a second earlier.
Perfect. And yes, it was. Well, there's a lot of things to unpack there, which I am going to try my best.
Please.
So the first thing is, I just checked. Can you, just to clarify, because we're obviously going over, like, can you see me? By the way,
I can see you.
Okay, cool. When I was looking down, I don't really think I was bored. I was checking on my phone on Netflix. The Rory Schofield thing is on the UK Netflix, so there's no reason for me or anyone else listening to not check it out.
Oh yeah.
Yep. So yeah, it is. Yeah, try stand up for the first time. So I'll make sure I check that out at some point. So that was one thing. Another thing, which god damn, there's about 1 billion topics I can think of just from that one thing that you just said. I can think of 100 things. One thing was that I'll ask you, the way you think makes me think that you think the way I think, which is a really weird thing to say, and it's almost like saying, hey, you're intelligent, you're a stand-up comedian, you're a musician, you're interesting, so am I, haha. It's not quite like that. But I think what you do, correct me if I'm wrong, is what I do is I'll think of like an end point of the point I'm trying to make, and I'll start on that, and then there'll be so many tangents in my brain of like how many things I could get. I almost get distracted by my own tangents of what I want to talk about. And what I often do is I'll half start something, and then it'll go off to another thing, and then it'll go off to another thing, and it would just kind of dot around all over. And then by the time I get to the end, I'm just like, I can't even remember my initial point, because and when I have a conversation with someone a lot of the time, when I'm even talking now, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking of 2 or 3 other things, may or may not be related. Usually are like, what's the next jumping off point from my brain? And maybe that's what some people say I'm a pretty good conversationalist, but I can tell that you definitely are by your podcast and things. Is that kind of how you think your brain works, almost like the ADHD of your own thought process, if that makes sense?
That is a good question. And I will say, I also have a lot of things that I want to say in response. So like when you see, you see me, you see, like, it's interesting because you have access to your insides and you have access to some of my outsides, and some of my insides as I release them out, and we get to, determine by what people are saying and how they're saying what they're saying and what they're not saying. You're like, oh, like clearly it must have been important for you to say this thing in this way, or if not important, there's reasons. There's at least some reasons why we're doing what we're doing. And I think there's a thing that my girlfriend introduced me to, the concept that now I've sort of seen a lot of places, which makes sense given what it is, but it's that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. And like, for example, there's a TV show called Justified that I like a lot. And I was reminded recently of the main character said to somebody once, if you meet an asshole in the morning, you met one asshole. If you meet assholes all day, you're the asshole. And it's because it's like the idea that, if you went around being like, man, everything seems like this, well, you're the common denominator. Like, if you're like, all of my exes are evil, everyone did something bad. I mean, it could be that you're like the most unlucky person, but it's often that our attitude colors and helps shape, like, there's confirmation bias. We look for what we believe. If we believe something and we see something that supports it, we'll be like, aha, there it is. And if we see something that doesn't support it, we may be like, well, that's just an exception. Forget about that. Don't take that in, and then also use that as data. Because we aren't just, perfect data machines all the time. And so this is all to say, it's nice to, when you look at somebody else, like I was just talking, there was a comedian that I saw a while ago, and I think it might be Orny Adams. I'm not positive, but there was a movie that Seinfeld made called Comedian, which was a documentary of him maybe 20 years ago rebuilding his act after his first, like, massive successful, like, HBO hour of comedy that he was retiring, and he's like starting anew. And so they were showing him, and then this other comedian, Orny Adams, was sort of like an unknown compared to Seinfeld, certainly, and showing him trying to gain his first levels of success. And I think it's one of his jokes, and if I'm wrong, well, that's fine, and I don't remember who it is, but there was a joke. Basically, the idea was his girlfriend maybe said that he was projecting. Like, when he said something, when he saw something negative in her, she was like, that's just you projecting that. And he's like, well, then I guess I'll just be like, you're beautiful and wise and funny and the best. And he's like, that's what I'm going to say to everybody now. I'm just going to, like, that's what I see. I see you are, all the things that he would want to be or want to think of himself. He's like, well, if I see that in other people, then I'm projecting that, which now to me doesn't even, and I'm doing this is many years ago, and I'm either butchering or perhaps improving, certainly in paraphrasing this concept, because it doesn't even necessarily seem like a joke. And sometimes there are, like, things that are true are some of the funniest things. But, like, if you call somebody an asshole, that could be an asshole thing to do. So you might be becoming an asshole by decreeing that somebody else is an asshole. Not to say there's any, that there is or isn't any objectivity. Like, there are things that are perhaps potentially more asshole-ish actions. But, like, I don't generally like to call people assholes. It's more like a love the sinner, hate the sin, love the asshole, hate the assholery, or love the asshole, encourage people in other directions from the assholery. And so similarly, on the flip side, if you think somebody's nice, if you're like, oh, I think you're nice or interesting or similar to me in this positive way, as you just sort of, reflected, or I'm reflecting back to you. It's like if two people are like, I think that you seem open and friendly and nice, and like, oh yeah, well, those you are both those things. Like,
well, thank you very much.
And thank you. You started it. But so even more than that, the point that you're making, or the point that I'll make about the point that you're making is, I think that does happen to me sometimes. I'm not as, and here's the thing, it's where when you see, all we have is access to really our own inner workings, and then we do sometimes project them out. So I might be hearing the words that you say, and then like sort of clothing those ideas in like my own concepts to be like, I don't have a problem with the way, I don't have a problem with the way that I am, and you might not have a problem with the way that you are. And I'm like, why are we even talking about problems then? Who brought up problems? Doesn't even matter. Like, a friend of mine, I'll get back to everything in a second, but my friend Zach Sherwin, a wonderful comedian, rapper, and other things in Los Angeles, recommend his music very much. Zach and I have this sort of concept in our friendship where we'll joke with each other, like if one of us does something, like, and the other one is like, I'm not mad at you, but you will notice that I'm telling you that I'm not mad at you. And so normally when you're not mad at somebody, you just don't even think of the concept of being mad. So there must have been something to be like, oh yeah, this thing happened and it made me feel a way and think a thing and say a thing, but it's not that thing. In fact, it's just sort of like Rumpelstiltskinning it away, maybe, like naming the thing and then be like, oh, and now that takes away its power. So the point is, you see something from me and you're like, maybe that's like what's in me. And now I see something in you. I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely, number one, there is something. There is a similarity. And the thing that I can share about my own experience is that, like, for example, on my podcast, if I have a conversation with someone, I like the podcast is called Broccoli and Ice Cream that I'm doing now. And I have 2 conversations with the person. One of them, ideally or theoretically, geared towards discussing the work of their life. If they're a comedian, maybe comedy. Sometimes it could be the work that they're doing on themselves in therapy or in meditation. It could be like working at a relationship, like whatever work means. Like I'll ask questions sometimes that are like, what was the first creative work that you did? Like, or what was the first, art that you made when you were a kid? Did you draw? Did you paint? Did you dance? Did you sing? Like, do you still do those things? And then, so that's one conversation. And the other conversation, I almost always start with the question of like, when you're not working, what do you do that you find brings you peace or calm or joy? And that's, so broccoli is the work and ice cream is the joy. I never my only goal is to have these 2 conversations, and I never force anything. If a conversation immediately heads off in a direction away from what it seems all of those topics, like, I mean, I'm glad it's a joy. It's a joy for the conversation to be what it is, and there's the joy. And sometimes if I have to work at it more, then there's the work. Like I will have questions in mind potentially, like that maybe that have always spurred conversation in the past. Sometimes one question will lead to an hour of conversation. Sometimes it takes 7 questions to have an hour of conversation, or a half hour of conversation, or 7 minutes of conversation. But it's not important for me to get to all of those things. So in a conversation like we're having now, where there might be like another thing that my friend Zach and I do, sometimes he is a rapper, he has written many wonderful raps, and we also sometimes freestyle together and or separately. Like if we're in a car on a trip, we'll put on a beat and, just trade back and forth. The opportunity to do that. Sometimes when your friend is freestyling and he says a thing that you're like, ooh, I could have a good thing for that. But then if he keeps going and that moment is gone, now it's sort of, you can do whatever you want. You can be like, oh, like you said 3 minutes ago, but the general goal or the idea of freestyling is to be in the moment. So if your friend finishes on one thing, start from there. Don't start from a minute ago or 5 minutes ago. If in the course of, of being in the moment moving forward, you then can construct and, go back and rebuild everything that you wanted to, that you could have. But you can't say all of the things all of the time. For us, we can mostly only say one thing at a time. And so if right now and if I talked for, 5 minutes or 4, 3, 7, 10, whatever number of minutes it was, however many points I made, if at every point, like in a freestyle, you're like, ooh, I have something that rhymes with this. Ooh, I have a thing that makes me think. Ooh, I could respond to this. Like at a certain point, you're going to respond to either the one that that stuck with you the most, or you found the most important, or the one that happened most recently, the one that you can definitely remember. And so like when I'm having a conversation with somebody on my podcast, I always definitely have the general gist in mind. Like the guidelines I have, the goals that I have are, learning about who this person is, how they work, how they experience joy. And then if they say something like, I make collages, I'll be like, oh, that's something that I have no specific real experience with for many years. Maybe I made them as a kid, but like, what does that look like? And then, that'll lead to a new branch of questions, a whole new tree of questions sometimes. And so I'm not always as concerned with getting back to the original, to getting back to all of the points, because I know that I can't get to all of the points, and I'm just always happy to be, in the middle of some fruitful endeavor. Though I will say also, in my comedy, which over the course of time, like the hour that I'm bringing to London this coming week, it has been constructed over the past several years, and it has within it, sort of layers within layers, kind of Inception themes. And when I'm creating the stuff, it doesn't always end, with every parenthetical being closed. But once it's complete, that is the goal. The goal is to, start and end, like where I want to start and end. Though that is, I think, similarly now to like what I was saying. Similarly now to what I was saying before, sometimes you just keep talking and you're like, well, that doesn't mean anything. But the way that I was pre-Rory and post-Rory, like they both ways are valid and valuable in my experience. Like creating something in advance, planning, and saying what I want to say is important to me. And also being open to the moment, being open to where the moment might take me, either on stage, in my comedy, in music, in a conversation, in a podcast, in life. Like that is also important to me. And those are things that might seem like, they could conflict at times. But if I don't get to say everything that I plan to say, either in a set, like then that's great, because it means I said other things that I didn't plan to say, and that's also a value. So I sort of value these opposite things. But yes, I would say in my ideal circumstance, I would, if I was going to start something, I don't necessarily know where I want to end up, but I always strive to be talking about things that are either important or meaningful to me, or present, something that's either, funny, or if it, depending what kind of, if it's a conversation, if it's a comedy act. The point is always to be, where I am. I'm in the middle of this sentence. I'm like, the point is always, I'm like, I guess the point is different. There's different points. There's many points, but whichever one I'm at is always the center. And then, but yes, I do like to, a way that I like for things to go is to start somewhere, head off in many directions, and then, like, if you read a choose your own adventure book, like, follow every point until the end and then return, and then follow the next one to the end and follow the next one to the end, and be like, and now finally here's the real story, the whole thing. We've completed everything. So yes, it's funny. I could now say, and so I agree that my mind does work like yours. And then you could be like, oh, actually, after you said all that, I don't think we're the same anymore.
Well, there's obviously some very clear similarities there between that. But one of the things that you mentioned was the thing of, obviously, with conversation, my podcast is very similarly. Like our podcasts have that are not dissimilar in that sort of way, which is, I don't like saying interview, because when it's interview, it sounds so informal. Like you sit down and like, right, today I'm going to ask you these 3 questions, and you need to answer them within this amount of time. And it's like, no, I just want to like this podcast is actually an excuse for me to just talk to people who are really interesting. Because like if I just hit people up that I find interesting on Twitter or something, say, hey, like a lot of my podcasts I do in person, I just go, hey, do you want to, come sit down in my lounge and chat with me for like 2 hours? People are a bit like, I don't know you. Like, what? That's really weird. But if I say I'm recording it and putting it online, people are like, you know what? I will do that most of the time, not always. But in those conversations, I will say, like, there's never a conversation I have where it's like, oh man, I really didn't like that conversation with that guy. There were just way too many interesting things to talk about. I had this itinerary of things, and because he was so damn interesting and he had so many other things to say, I didn't get to say these little 5 things that I wrote down when I was thinking about on the drive home or anything. So I do completely get that with the whole. There's lots of things, and the freestyle rap is a very good analogy. It is that thing of like, yeah, when you were saying what you were just saying, there were many points where if you had stopped, I could have gone, jumping off point, and obviously it kept going, and then it's just, I can't even remember half of the things I was going to say. So that's correct. I will ask though, because this conversation is going to go on a crazy train off the rails thing into wherever, which I'm happy about. But before we do that, I will just ask one question about you being a comedian, and then that'll be off as well. What actually, was there a thing that actually made you start being a comedian? Because obviously you say when you were younger, you played the violin and you created the persona of Myq Kaplan. Obviously it's Mike, but it's, when you started, was it a thing like when you were younger, it's like, oh, I kind of want to do stand-up comedy. You watched a lot of when you were younger, and then your dream came to fruition, or did you kind of fall into it, or was it kind of like a culmination of you did those funny songs you say, and like what was kind of the thing that made you actually go, okay, I'm going to go to open mic nights, I'm going to start trying to write and that sort of jazz? What was kind of was there a tipping off point, or was it like a consistent thing over your life of being a performer and whatnot?
That's the question is interesting to me because of all the ideas that it's spawning right now. Like the short answer is that I didn't plan to be a comedian. I had seen like some stand-ups, but it was really that I wanted to play music. And I had some songs that were funny, and I was just looking for anywhere to perform my songs. And so I was in school in Boston, going to college or university, and I remember just searching. It was a little pre-Google, but it was like Yahoo or Hotbot or some search engine.
Jeeves or something.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, Jeeves, will you tell me where clubs in Boston are? Like I looked for like music venues and just whatever performance places I could, and this place, the Comedy Studio, came up as an option of a place to perform, and I was like, oh. I didn't really know that comedy clubs were a thing. Like it wasn't part of my, like as a child, like my parents had like maybe listened to George Carlin. I knew who George Carlin was. I knew what Saturday Night Live was. And so I knew that like Norm Macdonald and Dana Carvey had specials. I'd watched Paul Reiser from Mad About You. He had a special, but stand-up seemed like a thing that famous people did. And I didn't know that there were unknown comedians. I didn't know there were places that these people had started that led them to eventually become as successful as they were in comedy and beyond. And so I was just starting from the ground up, not knowing anything, just being like, well, I know that I can go places and perform music. I didn't know this comedy club was a place. I asked them, can I perform my funny songs there? And they said yes. And then it was during the performance of those songs, or actually in between, like before and in between the songs, I would do what I would call now riffing, because I didn't have material, but I would just talk to the audience. And sometimes I would say things and they would laugh. And that was a thing that, this is a fun analogy that I'd never really thought of. Like, before I ever had done mushrooms, eaten psilocybin mushrooms, I had read about the concept of enlightenment, let's say. I'd read about like mysticism, and Eastern thought. I'd read these books by a philosopher named Raymond Smullyan, and one of them was called, the first book I found of his was This Book Needs No Title, was the name of the book. And there was a little story in it, a little allegory called Planet Without Laughter. And it was about, imagine a world where there was mostly no laughter. And some people knew that laughter was a thing, and they knew what it was, but they couldn't necessarily produce it. They couldn't make themselves do it, and they didn't know how to find it. And there were maybe laugh masters, and it was an analogy to like a concept of enlightenment, a concept of, mindfulness and like maybe Zen Buddhism, where there were like, Buddhist masters, and the idea of like, how do I find the meaning of life? Like, how do I become enlightened? And like, they would be like, people would go in the story to the laugh masters and be like, how do I laugh? And then instead of, they're like, is it like this? Is it like ha 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 ha? Like, if you know what laughter is, which most of us do, and if you know what natural laughter feels like, you know what fake laughter is. You know that you can tell when somebody's not doing it, or not doing it correctly, or like that they don't get it. And so similarly, like so the analogy was being drawn that at the time I didn't understand. I got the analogy intellectually, but having not had, there's a lot of hads. I had not had an experience like one that I would have with mushrooms, wherein once I had it, I was like, oh, that's what that story is about. I'm not saying I'm not an enlightened master. I'm not, a wise man on top of a mountain. I think a wiser person than I once was. At least like before I had the experience of doing mushrooms, I didn't have a certain way of thinking. And afterwards, I did in this a chop wood, carry water kind of way. And the way that's relevant is that it wasn't even a new experience. It was just a different understanding of an experience that I had been having. Like, one of the ways that I felt on mushrooms was I would think about like different, like sort of yin and yang type things that seemed present at the same time. Like, I would be enjoying a moment. I would think of a philosophical thought and be like, ooh, I want to remember this later. I should maybe write it down. But I was like, but if I go to write it down, then I'll lose the actual presence of the moment. Like when you see somebody like taping a comedy show, like
I was gonna say, or taking photos of things all the time, like being in like a beautifully, oh, look how beautiful the sunset is, I'm gonna pull up my phone and take a picture. And it's like, well, the act of taking out your phone and taking the picture is taking you out of the moment. And there's that weird balance of, do I want to capture this moment physically forever, or do I want to just kind of bask in the beauty of the moment by actually living it, experiencing it? I always struggle with that.
Oh yeah, and I hope that this helps, because that was something that I did both struggle and not struggle with, because sometimes that would become sort of like the meditation that would happen in my mushroom brain, where I was like, should I write this down? Should I just remember it? Should I be here? Like, and they're like, there's no shoulds, but. And even if I don't remember what these ideas were, but now this became one of its own, where I don't know if I ever wrote this down, but I didn't have to. Now it's like, this is a part of me. This idea of, wanting to or needing to or striving to be in the present moment, while also, gathering these nuggets for the future, like imagining future moments. Like, that is a very standard human thing, like projecting ourselves into the future, wanting to have a good future. But if we're like always planning for the future at the expense of the present, we're all like, our own time Jesus, sacrificing our current life for our future well-being. Like, when do you get the future well-being if you're always striving? Because once you get to that future, now that future is going to be like, well, got to plan for later future. And, which isn't to say that there's the simplest answer of just like, well, just be a hedonist now, just get it all now, just now. But that was something that at the time I was like, oh, now I can identify when a certain thing happens in my mind, when that kind of, like, sometimes when a joke happens, when you hear a joke or think of a joke, or something funny happens and you're like, oh, there's something incongruous. There's like, the difference between the expectation and the reality is funny. And that is like, it's hard to describe with words completely, but it's something that I had experienced before mushrooms, but wasn't able to identify as a thing. But now, after having done them, I could identify it, and I'm like, oh, I had the ability all along, I just didn't know it. And that is the way that I became a comedian, was on stage saying things that were funny, being like, oh, I didn't plan to be a comedian. I didn't set out to become a comedian, but I found myself actively being a comedian or doing comedy. I found myself saying things and being in a moment where I was like, oh, this is the kind of thing that I was doing with my friends, that maybe, sometimes in a group of friends, you might have friends that are like, oh, you should be a stand-up comedian. But it's funny because I actually had an experience when I decided that I did want to do comedy. I told my college buddies, and one of them was like, why should you do comedy? Like, we are all funny. Like, he's like, you're not special in being funny. And I was like, I wish I'd had the wherewithal at the time to be like, oh, well, then we should all do comedy. It's not that I shouldn't. Like, I'm the only one doing the right thing. Given the input, the data that if you're funny, do comedy if you want to. Like, obviously, that guy is a science teacher, and he's allowed to be. He doesn't have to be a comedian. He's a funny science teacher, and that's fine. And I'm glad that I didn't listen to him and stop being a comedian because, oh, yeah, if everyone's funny, then no one should be a stand-up comedian is like sort of an absurd place to take that to. But, yeah, so one of the things that interested me in your question was similar to earlier when you were like, I try to think about where I'm going to end up, and then I start and head in that direction and then get sort of, waylaid by different digressions, different branches. I'm like, oh, I want to go this way. I want to end up here. Like I didn't have that. I mean, sometimes I might want to get a point across. Like now I'm endeavoring to get this point across, and I think I'm going to. I'm like, I'm getting this part of the point that I'm getting across. I'm like, I will get to the end of this point about how I don't really care where I end. Like, because my initial goal was to become a musician, and then that branched off and I became a comedian. And it's not that I'm, again, not a musician, but I'm professionally a comedian, and I'm glad to be, feeding that. I'm glad to be fueling that because I have some jokes now about how, wedding vows, often are made like, I promise to be with you. I promise I will love you. I will honor you. And one of the jokes is about how, I don't know the future. So my vows will be like, I promise I love you now, and I promise I loved you before. And that's 2 out of 3. So that's pretty good, as far as proportions go, it rounds up to 1. Like, I can't promise the future, but I can only, and there's common law marriage is one where you're with somebody for a long, long time. So I feel like I never thought about this. I'm a common law comedian. Like, I was doing comedy long enough that I'm like, oh, I guess I'm a comedian now. Like, as opposed to when you start out doing a comedian, you're kind of doing that. You're kind of doing an impression of a comedian. You're like, hey, I'm on stage and I'm a comedian. And people are, similar to laughing. If you're not doing it well, people may be like, I don't know if you are being a comedian. Like, the form and the function, like the structure and like what fills it. Like, you chop wood, carry water style, you fill it by doing it. Like, you fake it until you make it. Like, that is how. And so the question of when you become a comedian is actually kind of an interesting one. Like, because you get introduced, you're like, your first comedian, this open mic, you might be, you're not just like, I'm not a comedian yet. You might be. But ultimately, the truth of the matter, it doesn't matter what you call yourself. Like, what is. Like, the truth is the truth. And so I didn't have the goal set out to be a comedian, but it did start happening. And then I was like, oh, and I like this. I'm going to run with this. And then I did start, building. Sometimes they talk about an improv scene as like building a plane while flying the plane. And so it was sort of like that, like building a career from the inside, or building not a career initially, but just building the experience, the aspiration, the fun, the goal, the joy of creating, like realizing, like when sometimes people are like, when did you know that you wanted to do comedy? And I'd be like, well, it was a little bit after I started doing comedy. I found that I was doing comedy and I was like, oh, I like what I'm doing. What am I doing? Comedy.
What's funny is because in your special, that's the special that people can go check out and things. Obviously, you have a bit that I would say I wouldn't spoil, but I can't fully remember the clever parts or the punchlines of it, so I couldn't spoil even if I wanted to. But you do have that clever bit, it's near the start, I believe, about you talking about comedy and being like, you know, when is the only art form, I think you say, is the only art form where it's only applicable if you're actually making people laugh. Like if you're playing music in a room by yourself, you're still doing music, but if you're just standing in a room talking to yourself and people aren't laughing, then it's a different thing.
Oh yes, I will spoil one of the lines, which is that if you see a movie and you don't think it's good, you don't leave thinking, was that even a movie?
Me and my girlfriend watched that. I watched your special last night, and when you said that, we were cracked up. It was absolutely fantastic. It's funny with let's get all the many tangents that we could go on. One of the things which you brought up there, which was mushrooms. Now, I haven't done mushrooms. I have been to Amsterdam and done truffles, which are similar-ish, I guess. They're like a type of mushroom, kind of. I remember it was a lot of fun, and there was like a brown curtain in the room, and it was started to glow. Like, it was brown, but because of, obviously, the way your vision changes and things when you're on shrooms and other hallucinogens, it became purple, and then it was so purple, it was making the wall go purple. It was crazy, a lot of fun. But one thing I was thinking about with... because I'm not going to go into whether or not I have done certain things, but I am interested, and I have been since a very young age, of just generally about drugs. I mean, in my, the term drugs is so bad, drugs. When I was in secondary school, so when I was like 14-ish, we had like a religious studies class, but the school we had wasn't very religious at all, in fact. So it was quite a secular religious studies class, more about morality. You know, we spoke about euthanasia, abortion, and that sort of thing. And one of the things we had to speak about was drugs, and we had to look into drugs and why they're bad, and that sort of jazz. And it was like, I remember looking into them, and it was just so intriguing to me. And it's similar in a way that religion is intriguing to me as well, which I'm an atheist. And it's about perspective, and one of the things with with drugs, it's obviously perspective shifter and changer and things like that. But one thing with mushrooms in particular that intrigues me quite a lot is with spirituality and all the sorts of other things that can go along with it, and Mother Nature, and Earth being a potentially superorganism that we're a part of, because humans are technically superorganisms because we've got like billions and billions of bacteria, and then obviously a gut biome is it's construed of even more bacteria, and then you've got your enteric nervous system, which can affect mood and hundreds of things. But with mushrooms, one thing I thought of a little while back, I was thinking, when people do mushrooms, they generally become, or feel more one with nature. You feel more interconnected with everything, and it's that kind of one with the universe thing. With a lot of fungi, because fungi obviously are actually more like sort of mammals and things, and living beings in air quotes, than actual plants, which I still believe are living beings. But obviously plants breathe in carbon dioxide, breathe out oxygen, not technically breathe, respire, or whatever it is. But fungi, breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide and things. There's a lot of fungi, there's a couple that I know of, which can mind control. There's one which is like a sapling. I think it gets into ants' brains, and then it makes them go up to the top of a tree. So then the sapling kind of comes out the top of their head, and then it's a mind control of the ants sort of thing. And what I was thinking with psilocybin mushrooms in particular was, imagine if what they are actually doing when you consume mushrooms is they are actually mind controlling you while you're under the influence of them, but in a positive way. So you're consuming mushrooms, and in doing so, you become more introspective, you become more one with the earth. You become, the trees are alive, and obviously I believe they are and things, but it's like, the trees are more alive than I thought. I can feel their them connectivity, and all their root systems connecting, being similar to neural pathways in the brain and things, and I can feel that. And maybe that feeling of that and that sort of connection is a part of psilocybin mushrooms trying to mind control people to make them more okay with nature, and therefore prolonging the life of mushrooms, just like also consuming them and you getting the good euphoric feeling and things. But I thought about that. Well, as I said, I haven't ever done mushrooms, but when I heard about the sort of mind control fungi and things, I thought of that. Is that anything you've ever considered, or had any sort of other epiphanies on hallucinogens?
I've certainly had it's interesting to think about epiphanies like from the future, because like while they're happening, they feel, you know, like, wow, like immediate and new because you're thinking a new thing. And now I'm like, oh, I've had loads of epiphanies. What are they? I don't know. They're just part of my everyday regular thinking process now, which is the fact that we are just a changing set of beings, not even, you know, of cells and molecules and particles flashing in and out of existence, even within our own matter, in addition to all the gut biome and I have a new bit about the 100 trillion bacteria that are in our 100 trillion bacterial cells within our 30 trillion human cell body, and like our cells take up more mass, but theirs are certainly more numerous. So it depends. Hopefully, you know, we're voting by mass and not by number. But also, you know, and who are we? Like, what is the question? The idea of mind control. Like, I hadn't thought of that specifically. I have heard about like these, like the parasites that maybe I think get into cats and then maybe transfer from cats to people as well. I don't know enough about
toxoplasmosis and that sort of thing, like a certain type of parasite that can. There's one which makes mice sexually attracted to the smell of cat urine, and you know, cats get mouse gets infected by this toxoplasmosis parasite, and then, you know, it gets sexually attracted to cat urine, and then the cat obviously would likely kill it and eat it, and then a cat stomach is the only place it can actually reproduce and things. And if humans get toxoplasmosis, it can make them have worse impulse control, be a bit more impulsive, that sort of thing, generally.
Oh, yeah. So that stuff I've read a little bit about. My friend Shane Moss is a comedian who I've been doing some shows with recently. He's performing shows it's called Stand Up Science, where he hosts as a comedian doing a lot of material about science. Then he'll have two guest actual scientists on and present something from their research, not as comedy. And then he'll have another comedian on, like myself, and then we'll all do like a panel discussion. So like I've learned a lot. Shane himself has a podcast called Here We Are, where he interviews scientists, lots of brain scientists, social, like psychological evolutionary scientists, and, you know, figuring out things about like what we are, who we are, how we are, why we are, how we operate. And he's actually done extensive like research, both inner and outer, in psychedelics, and did like a toured a show called Good Trip, where it was like hours of just like sort of information, like sort of like a funny TED Talk about psychedelics, which I think he's actually coming to the UK also in a few months. So I recommend either if I can get to him to chat with you, I'd be happy to put you guys in touch.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. And if he has a podcast, I'm more than happy to mention that as well. It's all good.
So that's Here We Are. And I guess my own thoughts now about what you're saying about mind control. There's my friend.
I will just say quickly, mind control, yes, but I will say less like I said mind control, that's on me, but I was thinking more of synergistic benefit, you know, mutual, what's it called? Symbiosis. There you go.
Sure. I mean, I want to talk about the words control. Like the word control is something that even all by itself, so one other plug for a friend. Ramin Nazer is a comedian and an artist. He's actually done the artwork for my podcast and for my last album. He actually also made a coloring book for Shane's psychedelic show. And his art is wonderful. He's on Instagram. He's made books. I love it's philosophical, it's psychedelic, it's funny and beautiful. And Ramin, I actually have one piece of art of his hanging up in my house where it's like the caption says, "I love control," and then underneath it says, "I wish I had some." And it's just like a picture of a being sort of like seemingly falling through space, which is in some ways like what we're all just hurtling through space. You know, we are attached to this giant rock, but you know, who knows exactly where it's been, where it's going. Like, you know, we can get some idea about what it's doing with respect to the solar system, the other planets here. We can learn some things about, like, the same way that we can learn things about ourselves, even though ourselves are constantly, you know, changing, growing in height as a child, growing in age age always, growing, like eventually entropically, like falling apart, disintegrating physically at some point, though always having been made of some matter and some energy that has always been since, the Big Bang or before, if that even makes sense. And so similarly, like scientists are trying to discover, like, oh, if you do this here, can we replicate that? And you can, I think Ramin has talked about this on his podcast, the Rainbow Brain Skull Hour, where like you're never exactly replicating anything, because even if all the variables that you can control for, you do, but the Earth is in a different place than it's ever been. It will never return to where it was even a year ago, even a day ago. And so, we can within context, like in a room, you can be like, well, I'm going to set up this room with this on the left and this on the right. And then you could have another one that looks identical, but, is facing the other direction or is sideways or upside down. And, relative to everything in it, you can, the closer you look at something, then the more differences you're going to find. Like you look at if every snowflake is unique, every human experience, every human made of all these different particles. So at the questions of, is free will a thing? It seems like not, but it pays very much to act as though it does, because if you're like, well, it doesn't matter what I do, then I'll just, lie around all day. Well, then that's your determined fate. But the question of what are we, are we choosing to do anything? Like it seems like it, but if you probably didn't choose. I certainly don't have a memory of choosing to be born. Maybe on some other plane, maybe in some other dimensional context. But it seems like at some point my consciousness just heaped together like enough grains of existence formulated into this being, and here I am. And sort of an analogy, a side issue to what you're asking that I think will be sort of parallel in a way is sometimes people talk about drugs as like mind-altering substances, and that I understand why it's called that, but also everything is a mind-altering substance. Like food, in a very real way, your mind is like, I'm hungry, and then you eat food, and your mind is altered. And granted, it's like a much more like standard alteration. You're like, oh yeah, I alter my mind every day, 3 times a day, or like some in smaller ways, or I have one large mind alteration every night, and then I fast for the rest of the day. And so similarly, obviously, like certain drugs or substances or plants or fungus might alter the mind in a different scope, in a different way than standardly. But also, like meditation can also, mindfulness and just slowing down and letting go, or being in nature without ingesting nature. And so, like in the same way that mind-altering substance both has meaning and in some ways, like, everything's meaning is potentially context determined. Similarly, like the idea of mind control, everything is also hopefully symbiosis, like that we're all striving, as humans living collaboratively, and then also, farming or hunting, gathering, whatever historically has been done to, be like, oh, what do we need to do in our environment to continue to live and have an environment? What parts of the environment can we put into our bodies and act as a conduit for? Like there are certain plants. I know, like I've done ayahuasca ceremonies, and ayahuasca is comes from a vine and a leaf grown in like South American jungles.
Is that the one which is it's essentially DMT, but it's mixed with a special thing? Because if you eat DMT, your stomach doesn't metabolize it properly, because DMT is in like loads and loads of other plants and things like that. Whereas if you mix it with this special kind of chemical, it's basically like a suppressant of that thing for your stomach. So when you consume it, it gives you a similar-ish sort of effect to when you smoke DMT. Is that vaguely right?
That is that. Yeah, DMT is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, and also it's present in our brains, and maybe what floods our brain when we die. And so also like smoking DMT, drinking ayahuasca, or dying probably have some sort of similar physiological effect of the same kinds of like hallucinations or lessons or experiences that one might have. And so if I understand correctly from the guide that I've talked to about who makes the ayahuasca drink that I've drunk, is that like the plants aren't killed in making it, like they grow in such a way as to like it's useful. Like there's certain plants that it's when we eat them or when we drink them, when we they grow and they have like the same, like whatever information they have in their DNA like has evolved over the thousands or millions of years, like however long they've existed, they've come to be in a place where they're like, oh, like maybe sometimes humans do this stuff and this is useful. Or like, for some flowers, they're like, we need these bees to come get this and bring it over there. And it's sort of like, it's a fascinating thing. Like all of the, the scientific, like cross species collaborations that do exist. So it's certainly, the idea that you expressed, long story long, of mushrooms being like, hey, if we help, I mean, it's sort of just, it's like, it goes along with the idea of like a nice person saying that another person is nice and be like, well, you're a nice person. Everyone's nice. It's just like a positive feedback loop of niceness. And that's like the mushrooms are like, oh, we'll make you have these feelings and that'll be good. And then you'll be like, oh, let's keep having these mushrooms. And then everybody gets to keep being alive and keep thriving. So yes, I guess I could have just said yes.
Yeah, but if you'd have just said yes or no, it wouldn't have been a very interesting chat, would it? It's just like, do you believe that? Yes, I do.
Yeah. Next
okay,
question.
Next one. Next question. Glad that we cleared that up. Nice and easy. Yeah, that's definitely not a deep question with when it comes to not just speaking about psilocybin, but also the idea of what is oneself. And you brought up free will and determinism, and is that whole idea, which is does one ever actually do what one believes them to be doing? So like the example I use for people who may be a tiny bit confused is to put it in sort of an analytical way, is almost if right, I'll put it in an analogy because I love analogies, and it's one that I quite like to use. I imagine humans, say your personality or your consciousness, however one would like to frame it, as sort of a tree. So, and what it is that when you're, let's say, born, sapling in the ground and it grows and things and something like that. Now, what happens is if actually, let's change that. Let's say you're a tree stump. I'm doing terrible at this already. a tree stump, and you grow out, okay, and as you get older and things. And if you do not have a traumatic childhood for the first several years, most people up to the age of 4, bar a few other things, are going to be fairly similar to a degree. And as you get older and more, the branches come out more and more leaves come out and da-da-da. And when traumatic or severely, let's say bad, even objectively, but the good and bad is a whole other discussion whether or not that's subjective, good and evil sort of thing. But say some really bad experience happens to you and it's traumatic, and I used the analogy of like a tree and a thunderstorm happens, and then a lightning bolt comes down and cuts one of the branches off. Now that branch will then grow in either, it won't grow at all any further that way, or it'll grow in lots of other different ways, but no, it won't be the exact same way that it was. And for every experience you have, it just is a way of your branches of your personality growing in a different way, but the core individual that you are usually is quite similar. The sort of the main trunk of the tree, in a sense. I've always been very talkative, I've always been quite extroverted, and I've always had quite a thirst for knowledge and things like that. Now, I'm not saying I was necessarily born with that. I believe my dad was probably a key component in those sort of things, but that part of me, no matter how much I want to self-improve and want to make myself, I'm quite confident and extroverted, but also I can be a bit of a know-it-all and I can talk over people and things. And so curbing that part of my personality does not take away from my general extroversion and thirst for knowledge and being a conversationalist. So each of the ways that one can sort of grow as an individual, almost the tree trunk that is the air quotes core version of you is still there, but the other parts kind of sort of branch out and things, And with the determinism and free will, it's that thing of like, well, from that point, are you really in control of anything? Like the stump is basically your genes, which is obviously a combination of, generally speaking, mother and father, and that makes the first sort of ingredients to make you. And then the experience is up to the age of like, if I say like 6 or 7, you have essentially no control in almost anything, or obviously we don't really remember anything before 4 anyway. So everything that happens to you up to like a certain point has already happened and in no control of your own. So the individual that you are, you don't have any control in being. And then you only really get, air quotes, true freedom probably I'd say when you're preteens and things like that, once you actually can start making your own decisions a little bit more and that sort of stuff. But then one can argue that, any decision you make, you would, as you are made in the way you are and all the experiences you've had to create you as that person, means you're going to make that decision anyway. If an example is, if everyone who's ever worn a top hat has been awful to you, eventually you are going to associate top hats with that bad thing. And you can look at that in like such a ridiculously detailed level of just like everything that happens to you is what we talked about earlier. Like, life is a perception of your own reality. It's something happens to you and it's this, say, objective thing, but because it gets translated into your consciousness in a certain way and you kind of then react to it, which is a translation again and a conversion in a sense, it's like, do you really have a decision? Like this conversation, me being a podcaster, you being a stand-up comedian, we're both podcasters really, and yours is much bigger than mine. So it's, being a podcaster or a stand-up comedian and things is like, was it that we were always going to do that because of the people that we met and things? Did you actually ever really choose to want to be a stand-up comedian? Or was it just you fell into all these situations that you thought you chose and then it actually made you one? And it is that argument of people say, well, if it's determinism, then no one can be punished for things. And it's like, yeah, but then if you never punish anyone for anything bad, then technically, would that then change the whole determinism way things work? And it's like this big old blah, blah, blah. I just kind of verbally waterboarded you there with things and stuff. So, thoughts?
So here my first thought is yes. And next question. But here's three things I think. Number one, the idea of a human being as a tree is interesting because thinking about, like, you mentioned the idea of like our neurons like are sort of as themselves sort of like tree-like, or like a set of like roots and branches and twigs and things. Like, obviously, like in your head there's billions of connections between these things, and as I understand it, like when you're born, like your brain obviously doesn't have like all the information that you will gain by experience, but it has like more, like as close to unlimited potential as your brain ever will. And that, like, for example, a baby can whatever language is spoken around it, the baby will learn that language effortlessly if all goes according to plan. And if there's multiple languages spoken, then they'll learn multiple languages as long as it happens within the time that is standardly so, like up until maybe age 6 or 7. And then after that point, those like receptors either like shut down or go away. Like the more choices that are made, then the more doors are closed, the more pathways are like sort of darken. And, and you can't keep them all active all the time. That I don't know what that would even like be or look like, because you will have certain specific experiences and you won't have other ones. So you won't be able to do everything in the world. You will do certain things and then you will become whoever you are. And I think that mushrooms actually does a similar thing, like temporarily, which is also it shuts down certain pathways, and then the other ones that aren't shut down are sort of like elevated, so that the experience you have is like a more, in some ways, like I feel like sometimes more confident about the thing. I'm like, oh yeah, definitely this thing, like, and without any of the potential like anxieties that also would have been lighting up had that not been the situation, which you can also maybe, again, perhaps train your mind to do with mindfulness meditations and other such things. It's not only like mushrooms that can do that, but it was just an interesting thing like that. Going from baby to non-baby, or going from, non-mushroom to mushroom. It's like a similar idea that like constraints, like there being less possibilities, sometimes opens up more, more possibility in a way. Like if you're actually your podcast, like when you described to me that we'd be having a conversation and we could talk about anything. Like the idea of talking about anything, like, of course, that's true all the time. But I was wondering, I'm like, I wonder what we will talk about, as opposed to if somebody says, this is what my podcast is about, then you could talk for an hour about that or 2 hours about that. And I mean, I think that we did both come into this with the ideas of what we might talk about. You have, some questions about like, who I am, what I do, and then that leads us to where we've been. Let's see. So that's one of three things. Another thing is, I think I've got to find this again, but I think I read a study once, or read that there was a study. I think I read a lot about studies, a lot more than I read studies. But the idea was, I think longitudinally, they followed like people from childhood into like late adulthood. And it was like a personality study to see, like, is there something, like you say, like, you're still a young person, but you're like, I've been this kind of person for as long as I can remember. And there was something, and that might be true. I don't know if this study will like counter that idea, but the thing that I remember, the takeaway was that there were like personalities that babies have, or personalities that you have as a small child. And then they looked at those personalities or certain characteristics compared to who the people ended up being, and that there was no correlation. Like that the person that a person was when they were 70 or 80, like could not be predicted by what they were like as a child. Though I think I've seen other studies that show, like, if there are three main personality types, like this one ends up in jail the most, or this one ends up, with this dietary situation, or what it might be. And now, the third thing that I think I can do it based on the last thing that you said. I'm stalling. And I'm hoping that it's going to.
Well, if you don't think of it, then I'll quickly say one
Please.
Interesting thing as well is obviously every aspect that comes into your life that one doesn't control. I have a good example for people is illness. People have got illnesses from when they're younger. Like I've got a couple of friends who've got immune disorders and things. That meant at a certain age they couldn't go out and do this thing or couldn't do that thing, and therefore them not being able to do X thing because of some sort of constraint which wasn't their control, which then means that they then went into a different pathway. And that's even more sort of taking a step back, one layer away from determinism, free will and things.
Yes, and while you were saying that, I listened completely and also did remember.
Perfect.
In fact, two other things. One is about the heap paradox, and one is about punishment. Punishment, the idea of, when you said, like, if there is determinism, then it doesn't seem in some ways right to punish someone because they are not in some ways responsible for their actions. Because I took a class in ethics in college where we discussed one day like a horrendous crime that had taken place, like a horrendous like murder, and the description was that the murderer had just like callously killed these two people and then just sort of sat in their car eating their lunch, like while their bodies were just there. And seeming like, wow, this person, perhaps they're a sociopath, a psychopath, perhaps they certainly were like, wow, like that does the question was like, does that person deserve the death penalty? Like, could that person, what should happen? And like, I'm opposed to killing in all ways. Like, I don't want that person to have done that killing. I don't want that person to be killed. Like, there's a lot of people who even have lost, family members to murder, who don't want the murderer killed because it doesn't bring their family back. It doesn't, like, adding more killing doesn't usually like make it better. In my, anecdotal, and I think I'll say at least anecdotal studies and things that I've read. But the next day in class, and speaking more to that, we read about a family where like the father was abusive and scared everyone else in the family, many children, including a child that was born prematurely because the father kicked his wife in the stomach, and she had this baby early, and nobody was allowed to touch the child. No one was allowed to show it any physical or otherwise affection, and because the father thought it was not his child. And so that kid just grew up with no physical manifestations or otherwise of love. And we learned later that that child was the person who had grown up to be the killer the day before. And so we're like, well, of course, that child is deserving of sympathy, of empathy, of love, of care, and how could we, of course, now knowing that child's beginning, like that child didn't choose that life, and every step of the way, which I guess is sort of the heap. Do you know the heap paradox? Which is,
no, I'm not aware of that. No.
Imagine like a heap of sand. How many grains are in the heap? Like how many how many grains does it take to be a heap? It can't be one. Like 1 grain isn't a heap, and 2 grains isn't a heap, and 3 isn't. But the question is, which number grain is it then? If it's 1,000,
is it 1,000 or is it 999? And there's like, where is it actually? And then if it is 999, then is it 998? And you can kind of go back. It's almost like the infinity of decimals, almost, in a way.
Exactly. And so similarly to the question of like, as a child, as an infant, at some point you have no consciousness, you have no control, you have no anything. And then at a certain point you do, like, what point is that? And then at what point do you have ethical responsibility? Like, that was the question in this case. Like, at what point, like, we say, sometimes, 18, that's an adult. 21, that's a different kind of adult. 16, sometimes 14. If it's a heinous crime, then it might, maybe even you treat a child as an adult. You charge them as an adult. And the question is, I remember there's like a Greek saying I heard that was like, Archimedes struck the father when the son swore. And because at a certain point, in early on in life, you are literally, part of your mother, part of your parents, part of like the people that created you, and then the people that are responsible for nurturing you, hopefully literally nurturing you, emotionally, physically, in all the ways that are necessary to become. And we all have ways in which that hasn't happened, because our parents were also like, everyone is imperfect. Has been no perfect human being, and everyone is like, society is moving hopefully forward. Hopefully, like that, there are definitely positive things, and there are definitely things that you can point to be like, well, that's still not great, or that's not as good as before, though there are a lot of things that are better than 100 years ago, or that we're happy to be living here now than 1,000 years ago, or but then obviously it goes back to like the question of like, who are you? Like, there's people who are now living in some ways today worse than some people were 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, worse by whatever objective measures you're saying. So, the question, you can go back if you're like, oh yeah, I am definitely choosing what I'm choosing now of my own free will, but like, okay, but that's based on, where your neurons were yesterday, and you can trace it back certainly to a point where you don't even exist, let alone have control over your thoughts and actions.
Yeah, exactly. And with that thing that you said about that person who was, had no nurturing father, and then he ended up killing people and things like that, one thing I thought of is it's almost like, it can almost go into the AI sort of big debate, is if I use a computer as an example, if you code a computer to do a certain thing and then it does that thing, then you can't necessarily blame the computer for doing that. Well, however, when it's people, you can. And once again, I don't know, the thing, it makes me sound like I'm saying, in a sense of like, it's definitely determinism. And I'm saying that the thing is with a lot of these things, I think, and a lot of, these sort of discussions are very good thought experiments. I think it's quite interesting it allows people who haven't heard these sort of conversations before, it allows them to kind of think about certain things differently, which can assist in other manners. Just obviously with you being a musician, that helped you be a stand-up and things, because of performing in itself and creating something is, hand in hand with being a comedian, because you do both of those things. So it is that the idea of, what with a determinism, free will, that sort of thing. I'm not saying it is definitely determinism, or you definitely do have free will. It's that almost, there's a tweet of yours, which is your pinned tweet, which I can read it, but I'd have to look it up. But I imagine you know what it is on your Twitter.
I can certainly,
because I just think that's brilliant. I want to certainly slide that in at some point. I want you to say it, because I just think it's fantastic. I think a lot of people have probably seen it. Someone on my Facebook shared it like a couple of days ago, weirdly enough, with a screen cap, and I was like, I'm going to talk to that guy soon.
Cool. Here it is. Things to remember. Number 1, you exist. Number 2, you matter. Number 3, others exist. Number 4, others matter. Number 5, maybe nothing is real. Number 6, act like it is, just in case, though. And I appreciate it. Yeah, it is what I believe, and it seems like it must be, when I offer all the possibilities, I'm like, it must be true that either this or the opposite of this or some third option or beyond or a thing that I haven't thought of must be. I think I've covered all or most of the bases. And I'll also add to your to respond to your idea that, of course, it makes sense why one wouldn't blame a computer for doing what it was programmed to, but one would. Like you do blame a human, or you can blame a human. You also don't have to. Like there's that this famous Rumi poem about beyond the concepts of good and evil there is a field. I'll meet you there, and that the idea of punishment, like there's a wonderful HBO show that I don't know if is available over there called Wyatt Cenac's Problem Areas, where Wyatt Cenac, who used to be on The Daily Show, covers among many topics in his first season. Every episode deals with policing in some way, police brutality, police as it intersects with homelessness or mental health. And in one episode, he discusses, I'm gonna not get the name exactly right, but it's a thing that focuses more on literal rehabilitation rather than punishment. And so there's like a program in which if the victim's family agree to sit down with the perpetrator of a horrible crime, a murder, then everybody benefits. Like they get to have a conversation, they get to understand, they get to express their feelings. If the murderer is remorseful, if the family, like there was the case that I saw on the show. It was just like a young man who had killed his girlfriend, and her parents they don't hate him. They're like very sad. And maybe were angry at points, but he is remorseful, and he would have gone to jail for 40 years, but they went through this program where they sat down and had like a mediated conversation, maybe more than one, and then his sentence was reduced to 20 years. And that's still, like, I understand it's good to have, if people harm people, it's good to not just be like, well, you can't do anything, just let them go. But, like, if you're in a relationship with somebody and they don't treat you the way that you want to be treated, like, let's say not, physically abusive, but even just like you get to decide like, oh, I don't want to be near this person. I don't want to spend time with this person. And that's sort of like what society is doing for like more extreme cases. We're like, okay, well, what is the best way that we can protect everyone and also encourage, like, to educate and rehabilitate, and like, especially for crimes where like the victim is the perpetrator, like, drug crimes, that sort of thing. Like, for people who are either addicted to something or mentally ill, and being in jail, like with other like different kinds of criminals, like people who are dangerous in ways that these people might not be. Like, there's so many so just to have the concept of like not blaming, like so when you said like, you don't blame a computer, but you do blame a person. I'm like, well, watch this. Like, some people are like, stupid computer. And also, you can be like, I don't, like this family didn't, like, the concept of blame, like, we only have like words really to communicate, and they don't always do it. I'm like, it's not that the person is or isn't to blame or responsible, but the thing is, if somebody's like, well, this person had these experiences, and now we understand why they behaved in this way that caused this harm. And so now that if we understand that more and more, it doesn't mean that now that we know, like, it's black and white, the other thing, like, oh, nothing is black and white, so we have no capacity to do anything. It's the more understanding we have, the more nuance we can gather, like the more we can hopefully move forward in kinder and more understanding ways. And I do think that, like, even conceiving of, like the prison as punishment, like, if we can conceive of it differently, like, I think there's like Scandinavian countries where like the models of imprisonment and the thoughts behind it, like, I think I read about somebody who like escaped from a prison there, and like here you would get extra time for escaping, but they're just like, we understand why you'd try to escape, like, come back and just finish up the thing, and there's like no extra, like, you're not additionally bad for not wanting to be in jail. And you're not, the question of like, is a person bad? Like we're all made of the experiences that we had, and some of us had more fortunate inputs than others, it seems.
And also there's that other thing as well, which we haven't touched on, which is, once again, in air quotes, like a faulty brain. We spoke about the neurons being connected and things, and obviously psychopathy, when one is a psychopath, that's usually a huge lack of empathy. And, you kill someone, not every psychopath is a killer and murderer, say, but, if there is an example of a psychopath who kills people and shows no remorse at all, it's like, well, if you don't have that proper neuron pathway or part of the brain which is teaching you empathy, then yeah, why would you? I mean, it doesn't make it right, but then it doesn't mean you can you blame them? Yes and no. And it's I think one of the issues which this world is facing a lot, which is what I like about sort of long form conversations like this, which I think really helps flush things out, is there's never really a black and white yes or no answer for anything. I mean, there are the odd things. Yeah, and there are the odd things which one, for example, this is a very controversial one, but like rape, I would say there's never a time you can justify rape. However, now this is a very controversial thing, and I apologize if I trigger anyone. Rape is bad, but there are undoubtedly children who have been born who have brought happiness to their parents' lives due to the rape. Now, I'm not saying that the rape is a good act, but every single thing in life has a different perspective. Every single, even language, where we say, is something right or is it wrong? Well, almost right and wrong is looking at like a 2D sort of spectrum. And then it's like, well, you could add this third dimension, which is it's right, it can be right and it can be wrong. And it's just like, what about the fourth dimension and other dimensions you could add to things? And it's like, nothing is black and white. You need to flash out these ideas. And you and I can talk about morality, free will and determinism and all these things for forever, let's say, we could become the greatest philosophers of all time about that. That not only doesn't mean that we've come to the air quotes correct answer, but exercising that part of your brain and discussing these things is interesting, and other people hearing them is too.
I agree, and I will offer you now what I think could be a more, at least, or a differently valuable anecdote that I think makes the same point without as much
controversy,
potential for and not only just controversy, but I've made jokes not about sexual assault as in making light of it. I think comedy, like any art, can discuss any thoughtful people hopefully can discuss any topic, and it doesn't mean that everyone who hears you talk about it will agree with you or agree that you're doing it as thoughtfully as you want to be, or that, and you might not think that you there's all kinds of things. But I guess the thing that I'll add is Stephen Colbert. I read an interview with that he grew up with, I think maybe around 7 siblings, and that his father and 2 siblings died in a plane crash when he was a teenager. And that was, a horrible thing to deal with. And that his mother was a religious woman, and she would say things like, and believe things like, what is this in the, in comparison to eternity? This is a small thing, obviously in the, and I might be paraphrasing that incorrectly, but that she was never broken, he said, or never bitter. She was broken, but not bitter. She was, destroyed in a way, but, and it also impacted him, and it made it so that he was like, well, what can anyone do to me now? One of the worst things possible has happened. And he then got into improv in college, I believe, and then learned how to that part of doing improv is bombing, and that's a much different kind of worse experience. If you've never experienced the loss of a loved one, and you imagine bombing in front of an audience, you're like, oh, that sounds terrifying. But for him, one of the things was he's like, well, this is nothing, almost literally nothing. And you learn to love the bomb, love that bombing. And then that's what helps you get better. And then, years and years go by, and his career builds and his artistry builds. And, now at the time of the interview, he's in his maybe 40s or something. And he has a family that he loves. He has a career that he loves. He loves making the art that he loves. And he's grateful as a human being. And he's grateful for everything that led to that point at this point now, including the ultimate bomb, which was his father and siblings' death. So he's now grateful to this horrendous tragedy that impacted his mother and himself and his family. And like, so I feel like that gets the same point across, that he's like, I'm not like, I would never wish for anyone to experience this kind of pain. But given that I did experience this pain, it impacted me, and I had to accept it, and I had to, like, I learned and I grew and I became the person I am in part because of it. And so, the question then, like, all kinds of like science fiction and fantasy movies were like, oh, if you could go back and, undo something, who knows what that would affect. And that can be like, in some ways, quote unquote, fun thought experiment. But there's one other thing I'll add about it is there's a quote I love from the book The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, which is, the greater that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. And I love it, and it doesn't necessarily help you when you're experiencing the intense sorrow, but from a distance and from looking back in my own life at experiences that I've had that were painful or difficult or challenging, like the idea that a challenge can be a teacher, the idea that I believe in Chinese, the word for crisis and opportunity are either the same or related in a way that there can be growth. And obviously that's not a thing to say to somebody at their father's funeral, but I also look at it like when sometimes like a much lower stakes version of this, like one time a guy like said something at a comedy show while I was performing, and I said something back that was funny, and people laughed. And then he was like, well, it's a good thing I was here, because if not for me, then you wouldn't have said that funny thing. And I was like, well, I would have said other funny things, though, and now you won't hear what those are. So you didn't do the right thing. You do get a good, looking back, you get either a good story in that situation or growth in another situation, or, our whole society is built on, like, all of our societies, all the world as it is now is built on the pain and suffering of, whole peoples in the past, genocides and murders and, slavery and, sexual assaults and all kinds of things that don't say like, well, there's joy now, so it's good that those things happened. No, like those things happened, and it's good to like learn from them and strive to not repeat them moving forward. Like if somebody's like, oh, you got a great story from a heckler last night, I still don't want a heckler tonight. I still don't want anyone else to, if you gain epiphanies because you get cancer and you survive it, I don't want everyone getting cancer so they can get these epiphanies. I don't want every marriage to face an infidelity so that they can grow from it, even though some marriages do grow from an infidelity. So like that's the thing about like fate exists looking backwards, I think. You're like, oh yeah, of course that happened that way because that is what happened, but it doesn't exist looking forwards, or certainly from our human limited perspective, we can't know it.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that the Stephen Colbert thing, because I'll say something about myself that you probably aren't aware of, and don't worry, I'm not a offender or anything like that. My dad died almost 6 years ago of cancer, and I spoke about it on the podcast. There's a podcast I did, number 30 or something like that, which is literally me and my brother just talking about it completely. And one of the things I say to people about dad passing away was, it was the worst thing that has ever happened to me, but it is the best thing that's ever happened to my character and me as an individual, because I would never wish anyone's parent to die upon them. Obviously, hopefully they will someday, because if, your every parent's worst nightmare is their child dying before them. But, it's sooner than one would hope. Is obviously your parent dying sooner than one would hope their parent to die is obviously very unpleasant. I would never wish that upon anyone, but it is really, I wouldn't be where I am today without that. That completely changed my perspective on everything. It changed how I look at situations. It made me a lot more optimistic, and things like that. It's made me go, okay, well, yeah, frankly, life can be soul-crushingly shit and unfair, and that's that. But life can also be like suddenly surprisingly beautiful. The times where you're in the most darkest hours, you can still have the tiny shimmer of light, and that alone can be enough to really pull you through stuff. So that Stephen Colbert anecdote is true. I completely agree. You know, I would never wish that upon anyone, but it has kind of put things into perspective, which is just like, you know, for me, it's, well, life is short and can be shit, you know, and so I might as well be nice to people. Like, life is gonna do horrible things to people as it is. Why would I want to be horrible to people? If, you know, I don't know what people are experiencing, I don't know what people are living, I don't want to make their experience worse. I'm just, as you blinking back to what you said much earlier in the podcast, you know, why not just be nice to people? You know, if someone's an asshole to you, okay, is being an asshole back to them actually going to help anyone? Or is it just going to mean there's now two assholes there rather than one, you know? And you can, I mean, one could even argue you could be at the moral high ground, and, you know, you get that good feeling of feeling like you're better than someone by not, you know, lowering yourself to their level. But excluding that specific part of it, is that sort of that thing. And, you know, we've been chatting now for almost 2 hours, and it has shot by. And I loved this conversation, and I definitely want to talk to you about this more. I want to say, is there any sort of final thoughts to kind of wrap up? It could be building off what I just said, or anything like that.
Sure.
Sort of a last few minutes before wrap up.
Yes, I mean, it's been great. I really appreciate the opportunity and the openness, and my sincerest condolences for the loss of your father.
Thank you.
And congratulations to the growth of your character. And of course, we all experience some, you know, losses and challenges, and we don't know, like, you know, we talked for most of this time without me knowing that specific thing about you. And we all go through life not knowing the things about other people. Like, we're all dealing. There's a thing I heard once, I don't know the original source, but I heard it on the Dear Prudence podcast, which I like a lot. It's an advice column and podcast. And one of the guests, I think, said, like, the context was, like, imagine looking at, some people look at, you know, photos on Instagram of other people having a good time, or Facebook profiles, and like, oh, they're all having, what a great life they're having compared to my life. And the advice was, don't compare your insides to somebody else's outsides, or their outsides to your insides. Because you only know your subjective experience. You don't know anything else objectively about anyone. Like imagine what you're going through, your worst day. Somebody else is going through something worse right now. Many people, you know, at every point, you know, people will, like, lose family members, will lose friends, will, like, not get things, will lose jobs, like, will, whatever it is. There is so much uncertainty. And the only thing that we have control over, if we have control over anything, which we might not, is our own reactions, our own thoughts, our own behavior, our own potential understanding. And so the idea of there are all these, like, simple, like, slogans that are they're simple but not easy to apply consistently and remember when it's difficult to. But, like, you know, the only thing, like, be the change that you want to see in the world. Like, if you see problems, like, think, what are the problems that I can address within myself immediately? You know, like put on, I talked to a friend on my podcast the other day about, you know, putting on your own oxygen mask first, to be like, you know, as opposed to, it's great to go out and try to help people. It's good. It's important to, like, to rally and protest. And if you have, then help those who have less. Help people, and also help people and include yourself. Like, be helpful and kind to yourself as much as you can if you want to, and also to others. Like, don't help others at the expense of yourself completely, and certainly don't help yourself at the expense of others completely. If you have to do one, I guess, do expend yourself completely and help others. But I think you can keep a little something for yourself, and
keep it balanced.
Yeah,
and that's what life is about. Life is just all about balance and moderation in every facet. You know, it's nice to have a few drinks with some friends, or smoke a bit of this, or do a bit of that. But if you, for example, with drinking, if you drink every single moment of every day, it's most likely going to suck. And it's with everything. You know, if you spend 100% of your life exclusively doing really nice altruistic things, it's quite likely that the other aspects of your life are going to crumble. And it's the same with almost everything, isn't it? It's just, life is all about balance.
It's true. Though I do think that whenever I think that I certainly am not doing exclusively altruistic things, but when I do the altruistic things that I do, it certainly makes me feel good. If not only certainly some of it's like, I'm like, oh, good. I feel like I'm doing a right thing, a kind thing, a good thing. And that's certainly not the worst place to start from. Like, I'm not going to be like, well, I guess I shouldn't donate to this charity because I'm really only doing it so that I'll feel like a better person. Better to be honestly a bad person than, fakely a good person. No, like definitely fake a smile once in a while, and that actually makes you smile for real a little more. And, and there is research to show that helping others does make us feel better than just helping ourselves. So I think I guess the final thing I'll say is a thing that I think about is I've heard like the Buddha sometimes would give one piece of advice and sometimes would give a conflicting piece of advice. And people would be like, well, which one is it? And it depends on your circumstances. Like some people might need to hear relax, and other people might need to hear, hey, like buckle down. And one person might need to hear one at one point and another at another. Like, so whatever resonates for you at a moment. And I do think that like right now, like it's possible that like if you don't need to hear like help people, then great, then you're helping people. If you're like, hey, well, whatever arises in you whenever you are like angry or sad or feeling a way that isn't your favorite, like I hope that you can address it as best you can. I hope you can help yourself or seek help from friends or professionals, loved ones or strangers, and we are, we're all here, and for now, we're in it together, and it is the universe. So it's difficult. You can't argue with that, or you can, and that's fine. I don't mind if you argue.
And that is a perfect way to end it. Well, before we go, just to remind everyone, so your stand-up special, your podcast, where everyone can find you, the dates in London, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure. If you're in London, 2019, February 26th through March 2nd, that's this coming Tuesday through Saturday, I'll be at the Soho Theatre in London. If you are anywhere listening to a podcast, you could listen to my podcast, Broccoli and Ice Cream. It's free wherever podcasts are free. And also you can get bonus episodes on Patreon or Kickstarter Drip. My special, Small, Dork, and Handsome, is on Amazon, and all the rest of my albums. The most recent one is No Kidding. Before that, Meat Robot and Vegan Mind Meld. And then also some music albums that I've put out you can get by just putting Myq Kaplan, the way I spell it, into iTunes or wherever you get your albums.
And that's perfect. And your Twitter handle is just your name, isn't it? MyQ Kaplan. But I'll put it in the description and stuff. Wonderful. Are you on Instagram and stuff as well?
Yes. Wherever, most places on the internet, if you put that name in, you'll find me.
Cool. Pornhub it is. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Myq. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Same here.